Good day, people. Hope everyone is well. It's been a while. Thought I'd pop in and say some things. I want to talk a little bit about the whole COVID situation that's going on. And I think the way to sort of set this up, or maybe to frame my discussion, is I want to talk a little bit about problems and the kind of, I guess, complex nature of problems, and then see if I can then talk about this particular problem we're facing on COVID-19, and then talk about different ways that different possible solutions help us think about this particular problem. Okay, so the first thing I guess I really want to stress is that, you know, problems aren't things or objects just in the world per se. You don't just look out in the world and quotes see problems. There are existing states of affairs. And when you can imagine an alternative state of affairs that's preferable or more desirable than the existing state of affairs, then you call the existing state of affairs a problem. So there's this sort of temporal relationship to problems. Again, largely the ability to imagine more desirable alternative states of affairs leads us to call the existing states of affairs a problem. And this happens on, countless fronts where, you see a kind of relationship between solutions and problems, that it's hard to see certain aspects of a problem, or it's hard to see the problem in its fullness without seeing the range of possible solutions, because oftentimes we see the problems for which we have a ready-made solution. So solutions in some way are the lens through which we focus in on a problem, kind of see it as the problem it is, because we imagine that this is the solution. Which also means that sometimes if we have a ready-made solution and we're already thinking in terms of solution, we may have misidentified the problem. Sometimes it may be very difficult to get a parent to realize that one of the main problems with their kid is the parent, or to try to, explain to a teacher that the problem with the student is the teacher. Again, there can be complex systems of relations. So in this case right here, I think we are caught with a very nebulous, very difficult situation. And when we ask, okay, so what is the problem with COVID? What is the problem? Well, it's obviously there are all kinds of health problems, and then this is a systemic problem. It's not just that an individual with pre-existing conditions is risking their life. I mean, that is certainly the issue, and there's a question of, is this going to basically collapse the larger medical resources that we have? So that, there's sort of a collective dynamic of how much toll can a particular country take on its healthcare resources, as well as, again, all of the different kind of health dynamics. And I think part of the problem here is that this is a very complicated situation. The body is highly, highly complex. Anatomy is pretty straightforward. Physiology gets a little tricky. By the time you get to the immune system, it is utterly, utterly complex. Your immune system has memory. It's partly related to blood type, like whether or not if you have an A blood type, for example, you might be ever so more slightly to a viruses, whereas if you have an O, you have just a little bit more immunity, whereas if it's a cholera outbreak, well, then you really don't want O. So there are all kinds of different forms of disease that relate to blood type and, again, to pre-existing conditions. In this example, I think COVID, it's been shown to be a lot more deadly to people who are elderly, but also people with conditions like hypertension and diabetes and asthma and other things. But I think in general, there's a sort of oxygen deprivation that happens to various organs in the body. Many young people have been suffering from strokes. But there is a larger problem, which is just lack of information. There's misinformation and lack of information. And it's spread on all kinds of fronts. And again, trying to get a handle on what exactly the problem is here. Well, it's this huge ball, and there's just threads in all directions of what is made this so problematic. Again, the number one obvious one is that it's a huge health crisis, and we're not really sure how much of a health crisis it is. Like, to what extent is it worse than the flu? I think everyone wants to say, look, it is worse than the flu, although there's uncertainty because there's just not enough testing out there. This was maybe a week or two ago where Stanford was, by their random sampling, they were suggesting it could be 40, 50, maybe 60% of the population has already been exposed. You looked at New York. New York was saying no. We don't, when they did their random sample, I think about 3,000 people, they said maybe 14% or so, and then they were suggesting that maybe it's like 25% in the city, and and then you look at Harvard. Harvard, at least a couple of weeks ago, they were saying no, there's been hardly any social penetration of COVID, so we're really going to have to lock down for the foreseeable future. And there's just all this. I mean, I think the uncertainty of it is really what's partly maddening people. But now here's where it gets to what's the real problem aspect. Well, I think in the U.S., one of the main. Let's go back to before we get into this. I think part of the difficulty is again this question of who's responsible for it all. And so there was this question of, was it China? Is China responsible because did they do various cover-ups, or was the World Health Organization, were they really to blame? And what we need to do is identify again them as the culprit here and sort of lay blame there. Was Trump in any way culpable? I don't think any country wanted this, and any country really handled it all that well. I guess, New Zealand seems like it's faring pretty well. A lot of countries have been hit pretty hard, and the U.S., I'm not saying that, how would I say it? I don't think we can just point the fingers and go, all this is Trump's fault. It's not Trump's fault, but his evasion of all the responsibility that he's had is pretty stark. I mean, he found out, and from the time he found out to the time he actually did really anything, which wasn't much, he went golfing like 9 times. And he did nothing but complain about Obama's golfing. He's done probably twice or more than that than Obama's golfing. And on his campaign trail, he said repeatedly that he was going to be too busy, always be at the job. He wouldn't have any time for golfing. Then you want to go, wow, this is really a problem. That is, we're having a president whose priorities aren't in the right place, and that was the problem. Well, maybe there was also a problem right here in the shortage of resources available to people. Now, I've heard, I could be wrong, there's a lot of information out there. You have to check for yourself. I've heard that some 18 million tons of PPE, that is personal protection equipment, was sent over to China early on. This is when Trump claimed that we weren't going to have a problem with it because we had it under control, whereas he thought China was having a problem with it, and it was an act of goodwill. Well, that was nice, but it was also, he should have done better, keeping up with the memos and finding out what exactly we have to do here. Now, when you get to this larger set of what exactly is the problem, well, I think we need to move into the bigger meta narratives to see about possible solutions, about different ways of thinking about what is the problematic nature of this problem. Okay, so obviously, I already said health is a biggie. We're all, concerned about our health, and we're concerned about the health of our loved ones and our neighbors, other people. But it's much more than that. It's about the economy. It's about people's mental health. It's about people having basic needs for themselves met. And here's where the way that we've responded to the coronavirus may have been more of a problem than the coronavirus. And, the U.S. stimulus bailout was maybe the biggest disaster in pandemic decision making in the U.S. I mean, this was an absolute disaster. You have to look back. I mean, there was a David Brooks interview a while back where he talks about it. I mean, it was just really a bad move. In Europe, they, as I understand it, a good number of European countries. Now, first, before we get into this, we need to go back and do the, healthcare in many European countries is already separated from employment. So the number of people who lost their healthcare in the last 6 months in places like Austria or Belgium or Canada or Finland or Germany, it's 0. Whereas people in the U.S., anyone who loses their job, they lose their healthcare right there. And so that becomes, again, a major issue for people where, again, their healthcare is tied to employment. But in Europe, as I understand it, when the stimulus bailout happened, many countries, anyway, many in modern countries, industrialized countries, they sent the funds to those companies on the condition that they were going to continue to keep their employees. They were going to pay their employees a salary as if they were working, and so people would still have income coming in while also still having health care because their health care wasn't tied to their employment. In the U.S., not only do people lose their health care, but as I said, the U.S. cut stimulus checks with very little oversight. I mean, I think the administration fired the people who got rid of the people who were doing the oversight on the distribution of the monies, and then they cut all this money, these PPPs, for small businesses and whatnot. A lot of people didn't get any funds, and those who did, they were given the prerogative to just fire employees. Now, many of these people are not going to get their jobs back. And that's going to happen for several reasons. One is that many employers are realizing some of the benefits of people working at home. That is, it's cheaper for them. They don't have to run heating and air conditioning. They don't have to have maybe a kitchen or kitchen space. They don't have to have people using their toilet paper and their basic water resources. People can use their own toilet paper in their own homes, and the people have to pay for their own heating and cooling. So, and they've seen that they're able to sort of blur the lines between work and home life, and they almost get probably more work done from people. Maybe they do. They get more work done. Maybe it's not as good of work, but I think many companies are going to move toward more at-home platforms, which means they're going to work remotely, and they may not actually need those jobs. If they do hire people back, those people who are in their 50s, maybe 60s, who are getting paid pretty well, they're very likely not going to get the call back. Instead, those companies are going to hire somebody who's younger, who they can hire for much cheaper, and who may be a little bit more computer savvy and able to handle the distant and the remote employment sort of stuff. So I think it's the economic and the social crisis of isolation. The stay at home is really painful. I don't think anyone, it really is taxing mental resources. But that said, I don't think it would be nearly as taxing for people if they knew they had health care and if they knew that they were still going to have some kind of income. So now, how do we get at that as part of this problem? Well, in some way, I think at least part of the problem here is that in the last 50 years or so, at least since Reagan, trickle-down economics has been a failure. There's been this promise of let's just let the wealthy off and give them tax breaks, and that money is eventually going to trickle down. Well, it hasn't really worked. It's gutted out the middle class, and now we have a super billionaire class while other people are just poorly situated. I mean, they're destitute. And, when you see people who have, like Betsy DeVos, I was down in Florida recently, and this was, I don't know, maybe about 6 months ago, and I saw her yacht. It's like a $40 million yacht. Is it fine for people to have a $40 million yacht? Sure, that's fine. I'm not against that. If other people had basics like health care and could take care of basic necessities, if they weren't starving, then I think it's okay, but it's not. And I want to make very clear here, what I'm giving is not a political argument. I'm sorry if it sounds that way. And this is not an economic argument. This is a moral argument that we are in a moral crisis right now. We're in a moral crisis because greed has taken over, and I think people have lost perspective on social inequality, partly because they don't know how to think about the difference between a million and a billion. These are really significant differences that I think some people just don't know how much a billion is. And I think if they did, they'd go, there needs to be a different way of thinking about all this. We need to understand economic policies. We need to think about tax structures differently, because trickle down is obviously not working. People who are making millions or billions aren't paying taxes, while us, sort of punch clock people who are making, kind of just a basic middle class living or less, I have to pay all of our taxes. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. But let's see if we can just add all this up a little bit, and let's see if I can sort of force it. And see, part of this too is that the narrative that's been pushed upon people is that they need to realize that the cure can't be worse than the disease. Right? They're going, oh, well, there's this disease, then there's this cure. And the cure is basically the stay-at-home the stay in shelter in place kind of stuff, and social distancing, and that's the cure. And they're saying, but that cure is actually going to kill the economy. And so people are posed into these sort of phony options that you're going to kill the economy if you try to stay safe, which is, it's so interesting, right? And it's, they partly want to reopen the states so that if people then choose safety, then they won't be eligible for unemployment because they didn't get fired due to COVID. They didn't lose their job because of COVID. No, they chose to be unemployed. So there's all these, and the president, he says, well, I leave it to the states. I'm not going to make any closures, but the states, they have the right to, and they have to keep their states safe. But then when protesters start to rally on capitals against the governors, then he helps the people become divisive against the governors. And even the states, I mean, having the states jockey with to compete against one another and have to jockey for supplies, to outbid each other, and then to outbid or to be outbidded by the government. I mean, I'm sure the rest of Europe is looking at this going, what kind of Keystone Cops mess is this? I mean, it's the response itself has been much worse than the problem. Or it's made the problem partly what it is. And it's partly lack of testing, right? It's partly lack of testing. Now, when you get back to this, how it's related to the economic thread, though. See, I think the economic thread about the difference between a million and a billion, some of this was interestingly proposed when Elizabeth Warren proposed her $50 million tax. I mean, she basically suggested that anyone who makes $50 million or more, once you get that $50 million mark, every dollar that you make should get taxed 2 cents. And that would go into basic health care, into infrastructure, into education, all kinds of public goods. And I think it was a really good idea. I mean, I think that's the kind of progressive thinking. I don't think that's socialism. I don't think it's communism. I think it's progressive capitalism. And I think it's what we need in these kinds of radical times of social inequality. And people who don't think that's fair, I think they haven't really thought about the difference between a million and a billion. So again, I'm going to go back to this. So see if we can make this sort of clearer to people, and I'll maybe leave it at this. And we need to start holding the billionaire class accountable. I don't want to hear that people are just making billions and then we have to trust that they're going to be a good benefactor and that they're going to go and be a great philanthropist and look out for our interests. No, I'd rather tax them and tax them real heavily so that we can all pay our fair share and distribute a real needed resource right now, which is basic care for everyone. Okay, so I'm going to see, again, to try to clarify this. So if you ask the real simple question, like what's the difference between a million seconds and a billion seconds? A million seconds, if you ever looked at it, a million seconds is, I don't know, it's about 11 days or so, about 11 days. If you go to a billion seconds, it's almost 32 years, 31.7, something like this. It's almost 32 years. Now, let's try it this way. Imagine that you have a long-lost relative. You didn't know anything about it. You already have your job. You have your income. And you're paying your bills. And you're able to take care of your stuff right now. You have a long-lost relative who gives you an inheritance. You didn't even know this person. Suddenly, here you are as a windfall after taxes. Again, after all the dust is settled, you get to keep it all. And you don't have to spend any money on it. You just keep it as one lump sum. You get it every year. And it's $50,000. $50,000 as a windfall. That's after taxes, and you get to keep it all. If you get $50,000 just as a lump sum like that, how long would it take you to accumulate $1 million? $1 million, $50,000 a year. That's right, 20 years. A mere 20 years. Now, that's a long time to come up with $1 million. 20 years at 50,000. But let's just say your uncle made a lot more than that, and you didn't realize it, and you have this uncle, and he helped you out, and now that uncle, after taxes, you get all of the money. You don't have to pay any bills for it. You don't have to pay mortgage. You have just as an added bonus and a lump sum, it's $100,000. $100,000. How long does it take you to accumulate $1 million with $100,000 a year as a bonus? 10 years. In 10 years, you're a millionaire. I got $1 million in 10 years. Now, that same uncle, he just gave you that $100,000 a year. It's the same situation. You already have your job. You have your money. This is after taxes. You don't have to pay any money on it. You don't have to use it any for bills. You just keep it as a lump sum. How long does it take you to become a billionaire making $100,000 as a bonus? a year. How long? $1 billion. Yeah, 10,000 years. It would take you 10,000 years to accumulate $1 billion. That means $2 billion, $2 billion, it would take you 20,000 years. 20,000 years and making $100,000 a year as a bonus there. If people can't see that difference, I think they're not really thinking, and they don't understand the difference of, this is not communism, this is not socialism, it's called moral responsibility in an age of great social inequality. This is not a political argument, this is not an economic argument, this is a moral argument because we are in a moral crisis. Thank you.